IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Sarayu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Kumar.
And in this week's episode, we are going to discuss the platform gig economy and the margins that arise from it. In the episodes this far, we've been looking at more long-term ideas of marginalization, whether they emerge from policy, whether they emerge from laws or from social context. But in this, we want to unfold and unpack in some ways something that we are seeing very much in our contemporary life. Rather, the platform gig economy has become the way in which very many people access work, but also from the consumer perspective, it has become the way through which people access a range of services, including driving or sort of mobility, access to personal services like sometimes beauty and therapies at home, and then also other things like delivery on the top of other things that you already consume, such as food. So this is unfolding today, and we'd love to discuss this a little bit more.
And you would have seen, those of you who would have followed the news in the last few years, you would have seen instances of Uber and Ola drivers and Swiggy and Zomato delivery persons going on strikes or sort of stopping their services as a way to protest the treatment and conditions of work. And this is something very different from what we traditionally tend to associate with a strike, because they're not formally organized in any form of union. Their unions are not recognized under law. They don't have any scheme for collective bargaining. And to be quite honest, most probably don't see each other on a daily basis. But yet they have managed to get together and organize and articulate their demands. But what is it that they are articulating? Why is it that they find that this brand new, fancy form of work, which is supposed to liberate them from the shackles of regular employment and give them more flexibility and earnings, why is it that they're experiencing such unhappiness with this? Why is it that there is a certain level of dissatisfaction about the way in which they feel that their work treats them? And what does this mean for the future of the platform gig economy, which everyone seems to think is going to be the future of work and workers, not just in India, but around the world?
Absolutely. I mean, and before we sort of start to unpack and understand the margins that arise in the context of this kind of work, we should perhaps spend some time understanding the terms that are involved themselves.
That's right.
Because not just is there the work itself and the way it is defined, but there's a range of sort of questions that arise around it.
Yeah.
The idea of the platform economy, which is now attached to the idea of a gig economy, is something that is fairly novel. We are thinking of tech-mediated work in this context, where a technology platform is the site where service providers and service consumers come on to find each other. And so there's a matching process that happens on these platforms. Potentially these platforms, and I think that would be the business imagination of this, become also the site for other kinds of services, which is perhaps why some of these companies see themselves as tech platforms rather than as necessarily marketplaces or mediators in a specific industry sector. But I mean, at the core of it is the idea that technology provides a virtual space for consumers and providers to come together and find each other.
In that context, I suppose we must also understand that there has been an ongoing problem, at least in India, perhaps in other parts of the world, of the so-called contractualization of labor, where instead of full-time employment guaranteeing you a job until you massively screw up or something, this by nature is temporary. So you will go from contract to contract, from year to year, and so on. And although there are legal mechanisms to put an end to this in the industrial context, there isn't any such mechanism in the, say, service context. And this is why we are focusing on the service aspect of the platform gig economy. These are all services. Driving is a service, personal care is a service, delivery is a service. I mean, we don't want to get into the software as a service part of it. That's a different context. But
I was recently told about service as a service. And so, anyway.
Wonders will never cease. But we are talking about the service sector, where instead of permanent jobs, what we are getting is kind of contractual employment. And the question is, and at least in terms of the word that we used, and we sort of want to go and talk a little bit about, is even the word employment. What we just mentioned, the platform gig economy, suggests that this is not actually employment. If we understand the word gig, it comes from the context of musicians and artists who go out for a gig, who are looking for gigs, which is a one-off thing where you get paid for your labor in a very different way. You have much more control over your work and you have much more control over what you do. But is that necessarily the same for, say, someone who is a delivery person or somebody who is driving? It doesn't seem to be. So therefore, the question is gig even the right word for this? Do we call, say, driving an Uber car a gig? Or is it not more like full-time employment without the concomitant benefits of full-time employment?
True. And the idea of a gig carries within it, it is a co-option from the language of music and perhaps some other more elite contexts. But the idea of a gig also carries with it some positives. I mean, our empirical work has shown that this kind of employment has low barriers to entry, in that it in very many cases takes nothing more than a cell phone to be able to do, particularly some kinds of labeling work or some kinds of work that is almost entirely tech mediated, in that there's no offline component to providing this service. But there's also advantages that we believe it offers to women in terms of the flexibility because of childcare or elder care responsibilities that they may have. It allows the ability to determine how many hours that you work. Given these 0-hour contracts are at the core of this kind of work, the ability to say or take periods of time off from work is something that is very significant, but at the same time carries with it the idea that formal full-time employment, which is governed under our labor and industrial regime, would offer these kinds of protections or these kinds of flexibilities, or have the potential to offer these kinds of flexibility in the context of certain kinds of needs that employees or workers would have, which is, say, maternity or some kind of leave policy, where here you bear the costs of whatever you need to do.
Yeah, and I think what we sometimes forget is that even the 40-hour work week that so many of us take for granted is actually the result of the labor movement. Even a day off was something that the labor movement had to bargain and fight for, especially if you look at the early history of industrial relations. And of course, if we're summarizing very briefly, it was a long and difficult period. All the things that we take for granted in terms of a 5-day work week or a 40-hour work week are the fact that there'll be fixed timings and fixed pay in a certain manner, a bonus in a certain way, social security, employee insurance. All of these were fought for, mostly by unions who sort of sat with management and demanded and got these better benefits. And eventually by the government recognizing that it makes no sense for each union to fight for this. Let us set a basic minimum threshold. Let us set a basic minimum threshold which will guarantee these rights to all workers in all industries across the board. And beyond that, workers are free to choose. But none of this was set in stone, so to speak, that even though the law may provide for it, none of this was set in stone. And we find that there has been a gradual but constant erosion of these rights over a period of time. First, by the fact that we are moving on from a largely industrial economy to a more service economy. And we're not talking about India, for instance. I think worldwide, we have seen that industries have concentrated in a few countries which have the right mix of policy and raw materials and so on. So it's not possible for every country to maintain an industrial economy at the same time. But we have also seen that practices within industries have enabled this kind of contractualization of work. We find that one of the things which technology itself has enabled is that the worker does not need to come to the workplace all the time. The worker can do the work offline or rather away from the factory premises. So there is a change going on in the nature of work itself that may make our earlier models of protecting workers' rights under labor law kind of redundant in very soon.
Absolutely. And I think that some of this, besides the transformation in the way we imagine work itself, this kind of technology-mediated work allows those who mediate the the interaction between the service provider and the consumer to have a very high degree of control over the way work is done. Now, the idea that, for example, there is a mechanism of physical surveillance, which certain kinds of applications allow you to do, is something that is a shift from the way in which traditional labor and industrial relations, or the context within traditional labor and industrial relations work, which is the idea of a fixed place of work. Yeah. So you are, no matter where you are, you can be surveilled, both in the sense that during the course of performing your work, you can be surveilled, but even at the time that you choose to switch it off, your last location is known. Yeah. And so there is something to the way in which this kind of relationship itself is changing, or is in the throes of some kind of renegotiation.
Yeah, and I think if we take the classic example, it's not as if the Uber app is tracking, say, the driver's movements only when they switch on the app. It knows, where they are, where they're moving, when they're at rest, rather when they're not driving, finds, not just when they have a passenger in the car, but also elsewhere. So in a sense, this is quite different from where you give 8 hours to your employer and the rest of it is yours. Your employer now has, or rather even the person in the platform as such, has much greater say and control over what you do in your time off as well. And this again brings to the point, should we be, back to the earlier question, should we be using a word like gig at all when this is essentially employment?
It's full-time employment. And for very many of the workers that we have spoken to as a part of our work, and one of the realizations, in fact, that we have at APTI in our research on the future of workers, and we insist on it being workers rather than work, because we think these are the people that are at the center of this kind of new economy or whatever. But the idea that this is full-time employment. And one of the most significant victories of the labor movement, if you think about it from the historical perspective, has been the idea that the costs, some of the attendant costs of being at work, so particularly those relating to health, those relating to maternity, are all things that are accounted for and paid for in some manner by the employer. Here, because of the nature of the contract, which is, it's a 0-hour contract, in that if you don't work any hours, you don't get paid. The costs of many of these are borne by the employee or the worker or the service provider. This is a very significant shift in that some of the arguments around the need for welfare from the employer was the argument that this had a social benefit or a social consequence, and therefore organizations or employers needed to take on some of the costs of that, whereas that is something that's changing, and this value is extracted and derived almost entirely by the platform that mediates this relationship. And I think that is a very significant element of the way in which this relationship between the service provider and the service receiver has changed.
Yeah, and if you look at the history of two big employment protection, two employee protection laws, like say if we take maternity benefits and also workmen's compensation, which I think is what I was just discussing. Yeah. Maternity benefits, if you read the debates in the Bombay Assembly, around the time in which the very first maternity benefits law was passed, the focus is not just on the fact that it's easier for these women to work or to keep jobs. The focus is that there is a larger social goal. Women's health plays a very big role in the basis for which the Maternity Benefits Act. Of course, no woman was part of the debate, but there is a lot of focus in the debate about how this affects the health of women in general. We want to ensure that they're not risking their lives and trying to come to work when they're pregnant and so on. So it creates the first range of benefits and so on. Likewise, instead of constant litigation, which would be needed to prove negligence on the part of the employer in each and every single case, and for the employer to show that he or she herself has not been negligent, you have a creation of workers' compensation laws. And workers' compensation law was not like a beneficial legislation of the post-independence era. It was actually technically a colonial legislation. But again, it was passed by, even under that limited mechanism. It was just an understanding that, again, there is a larger social welfare measure which is being provided for in providing employees these protections, which again is thrown into question by something like the platform gig economy. Whose responsibility is it? As things stand, the costs have been squarely shifted on to the employee. the Uber driver bears the cost of accidents. The urban clap service person bears the cost of any mishap. So, in a sense, no responsibility is being taken by these platforms for anything that happens during the course of work. Now, their argument seems to be that, no, this is not full-time employment, but the value being created for the platform itself, as we just discussed, allows them to account for this, allows them to say that, if we are creating this benefit, we have to also account for any possible costs. It can't be that the value you create is solely by shifting the cost to another person. So, if the value created by, say, a platform is 100 rupees, it can't be because you're taking that 100 rupees straight out of the pocket of the driver. There's a value that you're creating by giving something to the driver and giving something to the passenger, and therefore that's the profit that you make. But it can't be that where a driver was earning 200 rupees, I've just taken 100 rupees out of his pocket and simply said, now I can make profits from this because I'm just giving him a passenger. Or rather, if that cost was, the accident and so on. So, which is why we are left in a situation where there is a dissatisfaction with, this platform gig economy. But if it was so easy to shift in and out of jobs, it shouldn't matter, right? Okay, you're unhappy. We are unhappy with all our jobs at various points of time in our lives, and where it's possible, we shift out of it. Now, if it is merely a gig, you don't turn up for this gig. But it is not like that, right?
Yeah, especially because, empirical evidence is increasingly showing that this is permanent employment, particularly for main wage earning type of work, in the context of driving, in the context of certain other kind of delivery jobs, for example. Though there is also evidence to show that, it's often college students seeking extra money, or people who are truly seeing this as a gig, which adds to either family income, or is something that's done part-time while pursuing something else. I think the other dimension of this is the way in which to think about sort of how traditional employment facilitates the conversation between workers and allows the idea of coming together in collectives or in unions, as the laws have had or continue to have in various contexts in the world. The idea of collectives, and there's a specific gender lens to this because of the kind of work that women do on these platforms. Work like driving or delivery allows for physical contact over and beyond the use of technology to connect oneself with other co-workers. But I think what happens in the context of women delivering work on the platform, particularly in personal services, is that it's delivered in isolated contexts in people's homes, not even allowing for the kind of contact that, say, a petrol bunk where a number of drivers come to work have to interact with each other. And that is, again, something very significant to think about in the way platform gig work may entrench or deepen margins that exist, particularly along gender lines. Because we do live in a patriarchal context where women's access to technology is mediated by men in the household. And then now you're talking about a double marginalization because you don't have the opportunity to connect with each other. There are trainings, for example, that empirical evidence is showing that it's not zero, but it's far less because you don't have frequent opportunities to connect with each other. And that, again, is something to think about. The idea of isolation in work and what that can do both in terms of your ability to negotiate with who you're working with and negotiate the kind of life that you want to, but also in the social psychological sense of isolation and what it does to be doing work entirely on your own.
And keep in mind that, again, we're not talking about women doing this kind of work for the first time ever, right? Even if we just take the context of something like personal services available on Urban Clap, there were beauty salons. There were, perhaps some groups of women who would do this. There was some basis for them to get together, organize, and so on. If we go a little bit further back, the main source of income, this maybe not main income, but equally important income for women, was, say, rolling BDs, rolling agarbattis, this kind of work which could be done at home, which would be piecework, what we traditionally call piecework. Whether it is in terms of textiles or whether it's in terms of BDs and agarbattis, you take the materials, you work from home and bring back the materials. But there would always be at least that one day in a month where you go, you give in, or a week or whenever, you go give in your materials and receive your payment. And all the women come together at that point. So there was still some basis for women to know, oh, okay, there are others like me doing this. Oh, I can talk to them, understand what's happening, what's going on with them, and form some basis for organization. Some of you may have not read recently, but there was a very interesting judgment of the Supreme Court of India, which sort of granted women peace workers the right to claim employee provident fund payments from their employers. So again, employers meaning the primary employers, not even the contractors who found them, right? And usually these women don't have a direct relationship with, say, the factory they're working for. It is through contractors. And what the Supreme Court said is, no, that the Employment Provident Fund Act is specifically designed to protect even workers like this who will be working from home, who don't need to have a fixed workplace, and therefore, extended the benefits to them. Now, if we were to think about it purely from a principles basis, what is the great difference between, say, working in your own car, right, for an Uber, providing services to a driver, and what we just spoke about? There isn't that much. But the difference is that if you look at the history of the particular case that I mentioned, the women were able to organize. The women were able to get together and make a claim.
And some of this work was done in communities, right?
In communities,
so when we
yes.
think of the idea of work, and it's significant that this case is decided in this manner, but the idea of work as performed together synchronously is something that that underlies our imagination of both like labor and industrial laws, but also more broadly the idea of work itself. Here you're talking about work being fragmented by definition and disaggregated, in the sense that your service, instead of everybody coming to a particular place for the service to be given to them or the product to be made, you're talking about women going out, off into people's households, or sort of, various other contexts in order to do this work. And that fragmentation and what it does to the way in which people are organizing, coming together, or even sort of fostering a sense of community is something that is definitely under the throes of change in the context of this kind of economy.
Yeah. And I suppose if you think about it, the life of an Uber driver, or the life of a Swiggy delivery person is fairly solitary that way. They may gather together on certain occasions, right? But it's not in the sense that, say, if you were to go to a fixed workplace and see the same people again and again, there's a sense of at least some bonding which might take place, subject to all office intrigue and so on. But there is a possibility of bonding take place. There's some possibility of creating organization, of understanding common interests and mutual interests. But if you don't really know who else suffers the same disabilities as you, it can be profoundly isolating. And in a sense, it also diminishes your individual bargaining power. There is no way an individual driver can demand anything of Uber. You cannot negotiate a contract. It's fine to use the fiction that this is a contract freely entered into, because in a very de minimis way, you are freely entering into this contract. But it is, in fact, what we call in the law a shrink-wrap contract.
Yeah.
That basically it's take it or leave it. And there is a certain way to understand such contracts, but usually it's in the context of buying a product, or usually in the context of availing something off the shelf. Yeah. But can we use that mechanism for labor and employment?
And for service provision. Right?
Yeah, and in a sense, not even say service provision that the driver is providing to, say, the rider of the car, they're providing some service, but the driver to the platform. It's a much more complicated kind of contract that we're talking about, one that the driver does not have much say over. They can't technically negotiate it, right?
Yeah.
If, let's take, if we use the classic term gig, if a musician finds that they're being seriously underpaid, or they're unhappy with the terms and conditions of a particular gig, they can back out of it. They can get their agent to say, no, not happening, back out of it. Sure, if you're a struggling musician, you might take anything and everything which comes your way, but that can't be the dominant way in which this happens. You do expect at some time to have greater say and greater freedom over your own work, but nothing in the platform gig economy suggests that you will find greater freedom or control over the terms of the agreement with, say, the cab company. So in that context, what such kind of employment does is to exploit such workers even further, to make their existence even more precarious and give them even less say over what work that they do.
Yes, and of course, absolutely. And there's a sort of re-entrenchment of power hierarchies between those who have access to capital and those who are providing the labor. And it's the marginalities around this are even more exacerbated in the context of tech-mediated work, because a lot of the costs of this kind of work, or this kind of sort of changing relationship between work provider and work seeker are very much in the contours of change.
Yeah.
I think another sort of dimension to think about, which or sort of dig deeper into, is the idea of why is certain kind or a certain kind of imagination of work very important. Work has been problematized, or sort of access to employment has been sort of central in very many imaginations of what access mean, right? In the sense of in work mediates your access to, say, housing, because if you show employment, you're able to access secure housing. You're able to access a variety of economic benefits, including, for instance, things like credit. And then there is, of course, the political dimension to it, because a central sort of means or category of organization has been work and workers as supporting political parties or making political claims in a certain way. And I think at that, or that understanding of what the kind of work and how it marginalizes has on our polity and society as a whole. And that is something that we need to dig much deeper into, and also question in terms of sort of what are we seeking, what would we wish for, and we as a society, like in what ways is it changing access to some of the things that are the core of citizen well-being, or sort of the core of your constitutional rights in many ways.
Yeah. And I guess given the importance of work, I think that is why, and the impact that the platform gig economy is having, which is why we're now finally seeing legislative responses to it. Those of you who would have followed the news would have seen that recently California passed legislation which said that for the purposes of the law, if a driver is working for a certain number of times in the context of the US, Uber or Lyft, they will be treated as employees of Uber or Lyft. And in that sense, the platforms will be obligated to provide certain benefits which are available to all other kinds of employees under the law. This is only in one state in the US, and let's, of course, be aware that it need not necessarily be followed in all the 49 states. But this is a conversation that increasingly more countries which are seeing the profusion of platform gig economy work are looking to see that can we do something legislatively to fix this. Now, in India, there was a recent bit of news that the government is considering something like that. But if we see the 4 big employment codes, the wage code bill was just passed, it does not really fit within the paradigm of platform gig economy work. It is still designed for an economy which is basically industrial, which has people coming into perhaps an office where there is a clearly defined relationship of employer and employee. And nothing about it suggests that any thinking has gone into how, the question of how do we provide for all these benefits for somebody who may be a platform gig economy worker, somebody who may be employed by the likes of an Uber or an Ola or a Swiggy or a Zomato, but who is not really enjoying that legal relationship of employment. For all practical purposes, their work is controlled by these platforms, but they are not falling within the legal purview of what rights and benefits they're entitled to. And this requires, I think, some very serious introspection by the government also on what can our laws do to address the kinds of inequities that we see emerging. This is an ongoing discussion, and we may find that, so over the course of the next year, some legislative intervention may happen at the state level, may happen at the central level. But this is going to be one of those things that governments are going to have to grapple. That governments may have to wonder, how are we going to ensure that the profusion of the platform economy doesn't result in this kind of large-scale marginalization of workers, and basically call into question the future of workers themselves.
100%. And I think thus far in our conversation and very many of the debates have been centered on this idea of labor and industrial relations. Even, for instance, the AB5 legislation in California that you just mentioned, some of our conversations here in India and sort of even globally have been in the idea of how are labor relations changing? How is that relationship of work changing? And it's much more in the context of how do you regulate it as work. But a lot of the claims that some of these companies have made relate to the idea that this is not work at all, but these are tech platforms or the technology companies. And I think that is also something to consider in the way in which we proceed, both from the regulatory perspective as well as from sort of what are we researching really. And the ways in which technology plays a role in sort of enhancing these contours of marginalization is something to think about. One way in which to problematize this is that of access and access to work. The ways in which you are able to access employment or you become employable, the pathways are under the throes of change. So I think that is something that we need to investigate and sort of keep in mind, because to the extent that the ability to become employable or sort of employability is contingent upon your access to social capital or, the way you come from, and the way in which access to economic resources magnifies that ability to become more employable, to find the right kind of course or program that allows you to find the right kind of job. This is something to think about, because we do live in a society where there is huge amounts of inequality, and access to employability itself becomes sort of something that can enhance marginalization. I think the other sort of dimension around this in terms of the technology itself is that technology can offer a way in which very many of these are addressed or resolved, because what it can do is the point of contact, be a point of contact, particularly if you have the platform imagination around technology. And I think that it's very crucial to ensure that we keep thinking or sort of keep probing the ways in which technology can be a part of the solution, rather than as only positioning it as a problem in the way that worker relationships and work has changed. So I think there is something there to think about. Where is the solution to this going to come from? There is a legal instrument and a pathway clearly, but the law cannot answer every single question that arises, and by definition is in some ways broad. And so how do you enhance both sort of the standards around technology or the way in which these are built, but also the ways in which technology itself can be the solution? Can it hold, for example, dispute resolution mechanisms, right? At which then allow certain kinds of disputes to be resolved on the platform itself, allowing workers to have some measure of security around, certain kinds of problems that emerge in the course of their work. So there's a lot to think about, and I think we've scratched the surface at best.
Yes. And I think more importantly, we feel that this is something that needs to be talked about in the context of larger themes, and not just say the fallout of a particular business model. That this is something that is going to impact our society and is going to impact the way we think of marginalization in the larger scheme, and one other factor which might be leading to marginalization. And therefore, what will be the claims made around this, what will be the political response made around this, is something that we wanted to bring into the discussion. And that's all that we have time for so far.
Just very quickly, there's a whole amount of empirical research that's happening in the Indian context around this kind of work. Go look up the work of my colleague Shruti Gupta, look up Nupur Rawal and her team, Simran Lalwani, and quite a few others who've written extensively about the gig economy, some of the benefits it provides, and some of the ways in which policy can be understood. Look at Aditi Suri's work. Aditi Suri is at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, and she's done some amazing work on the gig economy too. And then Alok and I have a little piece. So shameless plug here.
Yeah, you will find the link to this in the podcast description. Do check out the pieces that we have written on this. And it's sort of as a way to understand some of the themes that we were talking about. And this is an issue that's going to keep coming back again and again. And we hope to return to it maybe sometime in the future. But
definitely.
That's all we have for this episode. Thank you so much for tuning into the Ganatantra podcast. We hope to come back to you soon with more episodes. Do stay tuned. Goodbye.
Goodbye.
Sachin Tendulkar, Virat Kohli, Don Bradman, and now Cyrus Brocha. Okay, probably not in the right company. I mean, Don Badminton is Australian. But it's called Cyrus Says, a wonderful show about everything. Find the show on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Did you know that Parsis in Mumbai, instead of being left at the Tower of Silence after they die, are now cremated? And why? Because a cow fell sick in the early 1990s. Did you know that the smog in Delhi is caused by something that farmers in Punjab do and that there's no way to stop them? Did you know that there wasn't one gas tragedy in Bhopal, but 3? One of them was seen, but 2 were unseen. Did you know that many well-intentioned government policies hurt the people they're supposed to help? Why was demonetization a bad idea? How should GST have been implemented? Why are all our politicians so corrupt when not all of them are bad people? I'm Amit Verma, and in my weekly podcast, The Seen and the Unseen, I take a shot at answering all these questions and many more. I aim to go beyond the seen and show you the unseen effects of public policy and private action. I speak to experts on economics, political philosophy, cognitive neuroscience, and constitutional law so that their insights can blow not only my mind, but also yours. The Seen and the Unseen releases every Monday. So do check out the archives and follow the show at seenunseen.in. You can also subscribe to The Seen and the Unseen on whatever podcast app you happen to prefer.